Modern Masters 2017 is just around the corner, and if you're like most Magic players, you can't wait to get started drafting. So let's just dive right into it. The top 5 most synergistic decks in Modern Masters 3 are Jund Sacrifice, Naya Tokens, Bant Blink, Esper Control, and Grixis Graveyard. While not all decks require 3 colors to work, the most synergistic decks will utilize a 3rd color. Let's first look at Jund Sacrifice. This deck is the fastest and most aggressive out of all the decks listed. Here's how it works. Step 1, make a lot of cheap creatures. Step 2, attack and sacrifice them as much as possible. And if you have the right cards, doing this will trigger a lot of abilities to happen at once, and this will in turn deal a lot of damage to your opponent before they can set up. The main color in the deck is black, with red as a support color, and green making a fantastic 3rd color to splash. The main card you want to look out for is Vampire Aristocrat, which can sacrifice a creature without paying anything, and gets +2/+2 for doing so. And this combos extremely well with Mortician Beetle, which gives +1/+1 every time a player sacrifices a creature. So it's a nice added bonus that every time your opponent sacrifices a creature, it also gets +1/+1. And while this deck works fine using just black and red, green makes for a great 3rd color, mainly because of Sprouting Thronax. Because if you have this comboed with Vampire Aristocrat, that's a lot of damage very early on, and it's going to be very hard for your opponent to deal with something like that. This deck will do very well against a slow deck that lacks removal, so something that runs blue, for example, but it might have more trouble against a mid-range deck that has bigger creatures than it. And that brings us to our next deck, a deck that also uses red-green, and that is Naya Tokens. This is a mid-range deck that can produce a lot of big creatures pretty early on. So here's how it works. Step 1, you make these mid-range creature tokens, for example, these 3/3s. Step 2, you use Populate on these tokens, making duplicates of it. And from there, you just wear down your opponent by attacking until they have no more creatures to block. The main color in this deck is green, followed by white, with red as a good splashing color. You want to be on the lookout for things that produce medium-sized creature tokens, not so much the 1/1s, because the idea is that you're going to populate the token. So it makes more sense to populate a 3/3 than it is to populate a 1/1. And pump spells make a great addition to this, as well as cheap removal. So if you do end up splashing red, there will be a good amount of pump and removal in that color. This deck does pretty well against all decks, but it might have a little bit more trouble against the extreme decks. So like a fast deck might outspeed it, and a control deck might outlast it in the long run. But this deck has a good chance of doing well against all decks out there in this format. And that brings us to our next deck, a deck that also uses white-green, and that is Bant Blink. This is a control deck with powerful late-game combos. Here's how it works. Step 1, you delay your opponent using blockers and instants. Step 2, you stabilize the board. And Step 3, you win with flyers. White is the key color in this deck, followed by blue, and then green is an optional splash. The key cards you're looking for are first, strong blockers, solid blockers, so that you can guarantee that you last into the late game. And then once you get into the late game, you want to make sure that you have cards that say enter the battlefield so that you can blink those cards and use their ability a second time. And then having flyers to end the game late is also a good idea. Because this deck's a bit slow, it's going to do well against other decks that are slow, and also decks that lack removal, but it's going to have a little bit of trouble against heavy aggro decks. I'm just kind of concerned in general about the control decks in this set because there's a lot of good, powerful aggro cards out there. So in order for a control deck to last, it really needs to be solid early game to be able to handle these aggro decks out there. Another deck like this one is Esper Control. It is the slowest and least synergistic out of all the decks here, but it's also the most powerful late game. Here's how it works. Step 1, set up blockers. Step 2, use removal to delay the game. And finally, use flyers to end the game. This deck will do well against anything that makes it to late game, as this deck has access to a lot of powerful things that come up very late in the game. So like this 4/4 flyer here is quite strong. But the downside to this deck is that it won't do so well against those aggro decks that put pressure on this deck every turn, and you really have to make sure this deck is solid to make sure that it lasts until late game. And the last deck to talk about is Grixis Graveyard. And now Grixis Graveyard is another control deck, but it delays the game using sacrificing combos just like Jund Sacrifice does, but then uses the blue to end the game late game. So here's how it works. Step 1, you put creature tokens out and use them to block and sacrifice with. Step 2, you control the board and discourage your opponent from attacking you. And Step 3, you finish with flyers and this ability called Unearth, which brings your creatures back from the graveyard. So like Jund Sacrifice, you're going to be on the look for tokens and things to sacrifice them with, and then add in some flyers to finish the game off. This deck might have some trouble dealing with the faster decks out there, but once it gets into the late game, this should have a very good chance of winning. In conclusion, when looking at all the decks here, I really feel that Jund aggro and Naya tokens have the most potential as decks. But I also think that there's going to be a lot of competition for the cards in this deck because Naya tokens and Jund Sacrifice both use red-green. And so I think that a lot of players are going to be competing for these cards. And so you're not going to see many of these cards being passed around. So even though a lot of the blue cards seem weak here, I think you're going to have a lot more access to these blue cards. So keep that in mind when you're drafting. And that wraps up for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, please leave them because this is my first video. I'd love some feedback from you. And I hope you have a great day.